Okay, I'm gonna call us back together again. We're glad to have some new folks with us today. What we've been working with in the last several weeks, with that handout you have in front of you, it's a 4-page handout. But we've been looking at the English translations that we have, and there's a lot of English translations, and we're trying to make sense of it. And we've been trying to put those into categories. But before we did that, we talked about how in the early church they were using a Greek translation of the Bible up until about the 3rd or 4th century. Then the church adopted a Latin translation. They weren't working with the Greek and the Hebrew. They were working with a Latin version, and simplistically, let's just say that went up to the Reformation to about 1500 of CE or AD. And then when the Reformation came, there was a call to go back to the original, and the original languages, the Greek and the Hebrew. The Hebrew, or the Old Testament, was originally written in Hebrew, and the New Testament was originally written in Greek. And along with that, there was also a call, because when the Catholic, or the church overall, which then became the Catholic Church, was using the Latin version, only the educated mostly knew Latin. The average everyday person didn't. And so that allowed the church kind of to control how the Bible was used and how it was interpreted. So when the Reformation came along, they said, no, we think the Bible, everyone should have access to the Bible, and we want to translate it into English. That was in England and Germany. We want to translate it into German. We want to get it into people's hands. And this is a real simplistic nutshell of history. It was a lot more complicated than that. But then that's what led to different translations, and we had a number of translations before the King James. The King James was done the first English translation, and we talked about that. We've had several classes. I was trying to give some of you an overview. And then, so now, let's jump forward from King James up to today, and we have a number of different translations out there. So it used to be, if you would go into a Christian bookstore, say, I want to buy a Bible. Okay, we got some King James, we got the new King James, we got the new RSV. Now we have the new RSV updated edition, and we have a devotional Bible for the NLT, and we have a study Bible for the NIV, and so forth. So it gets complicated. And then, okay, and I've had a number of you come to me and say, what Bible should I read? Yeah. So that's why we're working at this. We want to know. So what we did first, we worked with the first page on your handout. We talked about what a word-for-word translation is. We're really going to go over that this morning. You can read the handout and look at that. And as you can see, there are a number of examples I listed there. Now, the problem is, someone might look at this list and say, well, I don't know about this. This translation might be more of a thought for thought. And the problem is, whenever we have something and then we try to make sense of it by making categories, any category scheme we come up with for taxonomy, it's going to be input. So, but hopefully it's helpful. That's why we do it in the first place. So it's not going to be, and you'll find this as we go. So what we did is we took Matthew 1:18, and I read that in the Greek, and I've translated it for you as literally as possible. And now we're going to take that through each of the types of translations. We took it through the new Revised Standard Version, updated edition, and we compared that to the Greek. That was on page 1. Now we're going to look at the next translation type, and I started going over it last week, and then we started talking about translations in general. And the last 2 weeks, we had some very, very good discussions. People were asking questions about translations that you must have been, you know, I won't say holding in, but you've had these questions for a while, so we're able to have some good discussions. Now, thought for thought translation. Okay, you know what a word for word translation is, and that's where we try to preserve the grammatical structures, the word order as much as possible. But when we do that, that kind of leads for a choppy and an awkward translation. So so people have said, well, I don't like the King James, and forget the these and the thous, but the King James is it's a very good translation for its time, but it is a word for word translation, but it's very choppy and it's awkward to read. And some of that is because they're trying to translate it word for word. And so a thought for thought translation comes along. Eugene Nada from the American Bible Society in the 1940s, he said, hey, this is, let's start translating it, the Bible from meaning for meaning or thought for thought, instead of just word for word. So you take a phrase, you take a verse, or you take a sentence, try to get the thought of the meaning. Don't get away from the original Hebrew or the Greek. Try to keep that as much as you can, but let's make it more readable than a word for word translation. So that's what a thought for thought translation is. If you look at the handout, I'll start reading from that. In the translation theory, the technical term is dynamic equivalence. And what that means is we're translating an equivalent message, an equivalent thought, an equivalent concept. And we're translating that from the source language, which in this case would be Hebrew and the Old Testament, Greek and the New Testament, to the target language, which is today's language. And we're working with English. You were in Germany, you might be working with the German translation, how you would translate that into German. But that's just a sophisticated or a technical, theoretical term for a thought for thought translation. That's really what a dynamic equivalence translation is. It ends up being a thought for thought translation. So again, we're taking a sentence, I'm reading from the handout, we're taking a sentence or a phrase from the ancient languages, and we're trying to render the meaning of this sentence or phrase in the modern language, in this case English, as close as possible. So instead of a word for word translation, we have a thought for thought translation. And of course, the goal is to translate the meaning of each thought. So you're not being restricted to each word, but you're trying to work with a thought. And what this allows then is a looser and a freer translation. So the emphasis isn't so much on the word order. Can we let Mary Jane in, Jake? MJ, yeah, there you go. Thank you. So if you can't make it, but you want to see what's going on and you're at home, you know, you can zoom in, and some of you have done that. So the emphasis isn't so much on the word order. IMJ isn't so much on the word order or the grammar of the ancient languages, but rather it's an attempt to express in translation the concept, the idea, the message that's being conveyed in the original languages. Okay, what do you think? Or any questions about that? Thought for thought. We've already worked at word for word translation. I think you have a pretty good idea of that. Now, do you see where we're going with thought for thought? Okay. what do you think some advantages would be of a thought for thought translation?
Easier to understand.
Yeah, easier to understand, and that's really the whole goal is, it's not that word for word translations aren't readable, they are. But the goal is to make thought for thought translations more readable and to flow in today's language better than just trying to preserve the word order of the original language.
I don't know what
Karen?
I don't know what these examples are.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's okay.
I don't know what they mean, sorry.
NLT, New Living Translation. Pat's not here, my wife, she's not here, but she has been using that for years. Contemporary English version, we really haven't used that much in this class. And don't confuse that with the Contemporary English Bible. So there's CEV. Yeah, and this is where it gets, nuts. There's the CEV and then there's the CEB. And our pastors have been using the CEB, Common English Bible, from time to time. You see, our pastors, sometimes they'll use a paraphrase, they'll use a message. Sometimes they'll use the new RSV, updated edition, new revised standard, updated edition. It's a mouthful, I'm sorry. And sometimes they might use the Pew Bible. The Bible we have in the pews is the New International Version, NIV. So we got all these acronyms. So don't ever hesitate, to ask again what that is, because it doesn't take long. Now the GNT, that's not the Great New Testament. That's the Good News translation, which used to be the Good News Bible. Now we're going back to the 60s and 70s on this one. So some of us, kind of grew up with the Good News Bible, and now that got updated. That's a Good News translation. So these are at least 3 examples, and there's more, but these I didn't. Yeah. Anyway, I just kept it to 3. These are 3 examples of what we call thought for thought translations. So advantages are these thought for thought translations. They're easier to understand, they're easier to read. And what it does is I've been talking to figure out, is that it eliminates the choppy and awkward wording of a word for word translation. And again, it's not that the word right.
What's the boundary between paraphrase and thought for thought?
We will talk about that, but I'll hit upon that right now. When you start getting into a paraphrase, you start moving away from translating to interpreting. So our goal is when we read a translation, we want to know, so we read it, and then let's say we read a verse, then we want to know what it means. And then we want to know what it means for us today. And then we start to interpret that. Well, in a translation, all we want to do is take the source language, whatever that is, the Greek or the Hebrew, and come up with a translation, whether it's word for word or thought for thought. But we don't want to throw anything in there that's interpreting it. Now, having said that, we are all products of our environment. So there's always going to be a degree of interpretation in a translation. And I may leave it at that, but we try to keep that at a minimum where a paraphrase isn't shy about interpreting it. And we will look. Page 4 is paraphrase, and I don't think we'll get there today because what time is it already? 9:34. But we won't get to a paraphrase today, but we'll get there. And when we get there, we'll be able to see what the difference is. A disadvantage of a thought for thought translation is what spurred your question, is that it makes it easy, Ray, for us to go into a paraphrase because you're doing thought for thought. In fact, there are some people some scholars who will argue that you have a word for word translation, and they call it metaverse, and then you have metaphrase, which is everything else. So thought for thought translations in their mind would be, but I'm arguing no. There's something in the middle. There's a thought for, and there's a lot of, it's not me, there's a lot of scholars who, the majority of scholars argue thought for thought, and the thought for thought translation isn't really a paraphrase when you look at the paraphrases that we do have. But I can see why people could argue, could make that argument. Because you're getting away from the word for word and thought for thought. And then at what point does that stop? So what I want to say now is that when we start talking about word for word and thought for thought translations, sometimes they will, a word for word translation at one point or another, and it might not be very long, might cross the line into a thought for thought translation. And then we do see this happen, and I think we'll see an example in a minute where thought for thought translation can go into a paraphrase. But overall, they, most of these translations stick with it. It's not to say they won't cross the line, and that's when I say that whenever we come up with a category, lines are to be crossed, rules are made to be broken, all that kind of thing. So it's hard to strictly say this is a word for word translation, because every now and then it's going to be a lot. But overall, it's going to stick to it. Does that help with the paraphrase? And when we get to the paraphrase, the message is a paraphrase, and our pastors do use that. And I'm not a big fan of paraphrase, but if you're going to use one, a message is probably, it is a good one, I should say. It's a good paraphrase. And I know why the pastors use that, because, and I told you the story, my dad, when the Living Bible was out, that was a paraphrase, and he taught Sunday school every third week. So when I was in grad school or in the pastor, and I'd come home and he had his notes out there and on a table in a separate room, and he had the Living Bible out, which was a paraphrase. And I said, Dad, work with the translation, and then if you want to go to a paraphrase, do that. And he said, no, I go to a paraphrase first because it helps me to understand what's going on. Even though the danger with a paraphrase is you're working with the interpretation and theology of the person who's writing the paraphrase. That's the danger, and that's why I'm a little bit reticent toward paraphrases, because I'm more concerned. I mean, I read Greek and Hebrew, and I'm more concerned about what the original translation was. But for my father, it was helpful for him to at least get an understanding, and then he could go back to a word for word translation, and then he wouldn't have to buy or accept what the paraphrase said. It helped him enter into it. So I think the message could be helpful to us in that way. But as long as we're careful and don't get too overboard with a paraphrase. But okay, so we and I think we covered the disadvantages of a thought for thought translation. It could move us into a paraphrase pretty quickly if we're not careful, and cover the advantages.
Dave
Yes, we got Craig.
and Joe, maybe, at the time that King James was being worked on, if there are any individuals or groups that were lobbying for more thought to thought
Yeah,
to it, and it was a conscious decision to not do that.
I'm going to say that's correct. It was a conscious decision. Joe, you might have something to say, because we do have, trying to think of, was it the Tyndale or no, it was the Wycliffe version that was a word for word translation, and then they wanted to have a more freer translation. Am I right on that, Joe? They wanted to have a more freer translation, and so they had both with the Wycliffe version. This was way back in 1382. We covered this in several weeks ago. So that was out there. I do think with the King James, it was very intentional at the beginning. They had, I think it was 54 translators, and they had 6 teams of the people who were translating. And so this was, I mean, the King James was it for a long time. In fact, they did a lot of revisions from 1611. That's when it was completed. And then they did a lot of revisions up to 1769. They really learned more about translating. And that was a good, solid translation. But then we started learning more about the Bible itself. We started uncovering, at least for the Old Testament, we started uncovering manuscripts that didn't exist for the King James translators, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so now we knew more about it. Now we know more about the Bible, and we have more access to ancient manuscripts that the King James translators didn't have access to. And so it was a great translation for its time. And I told you that when I read Hebrew and I come to a verse that I'm not quite sure about, sometimes I'll go to the King James first because I know that's going to give me a good word for word translation. And it's going to give me a good word for word translation. No,
Dave,
Anna.
the disadvantages, I think I mentioned last week, Keith Blair suggests that lose the poetry in King James.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
like that kind of.
Okay, if you grow up with the King James, and the King James is, I remember when I was when I was teaching at a grad school, we were, the faculty, we were all in a meeting and we were talking about Psalm 23, and one of the persons in the meeting was saying Psalm 23 basically has taken on a life of its own. And that life has come from the King James. And it's very poetic. And we've come to know that, at least some of us, and we've memorized it, and we hear it at funerals. We hear it in television and movies and things like that. And so there are some phrases where the newer translations want to change the phrases because we know more about Psalm 23, and people don't like that. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Well, we now know. Forgive me here. This is one Hebrew word. Notice I wrote from right to left. And this means deep darkness. Well, when the King James translators came to this word, they translated it as 2 words. Shadow of death. Zalmavet means deep darkness. Zalmavet means shadow of death. So, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. No, yea, though I walk through the valley of deep darkness. So, I don't know. Some people felt that walking through the valley of the shadow of death is more poetic than walking through the valley of deep darkness. And they were used. And so the newer translations, they come out and they change it. But what they do is they put a footnote. Most of them do. Some are getting away from that. And they'll footnote in your English where it says shadow of death, and they'll say deep darkness. Or they'll translate it as deep darkness and put a footnote there and say valley of the shadow of death. Some of you are looking it up. What does yours say, Jake?
Mine says even though I walk through the darkest valley, but there is a footnote that says, or the valley of the shadow of death.
So,
That's New Revised Standard.
But-
Abraham Lincoln, in his speeches, used the style of the King James Version. The Gettysburg Address starts out 7 years ago, and that's taken from one of the Psalms where it talks about the length of years of the what is three score?
three score and
Three score
ten.
and 10, yeah.
That's Psalm 90. Now, I'm just gonna take a little side trip here, and I'm not gonna go very far. But sometimes people read Psalm 90 because it says in there that, an average person lives about 70, which is 70. A score is what, 20? 10 is 70. And some people have said, like, well, we're basically guaranteed to live to 70. Well, we know we're not, because young people die and, whatever, so that doesn't. But if you read that psalm carefully, it's a lament. It's a lament that if we're lucky, we only live to be 70 years old. And here's God in infinity. And here we are, we live 70 years old. So compared to God, we're a blade of grass. Then in the morning, it shoots up, and in the evening, it withers. And when in my first pastorate, I was in a hospital. A man died. He had a stroke, and then he had a heart attack. So he didn't have a chance after his stroke, but he died. So I'm working with the family, and out of nowhere, I don't think this would happen now, but out of nowhere, there comes some guy from a different church, and he shouldn't have been with his family. It wouldn't happen there. But and he sits down with the family, and he says, how old was your loved one? He was 73. Oh, well, he got 3 extra years. Yeah. Hey, terrible. And so I basically found a nice way to kick him out. Say, look, I'm
The valley of.
And then, we get home. I get home and I get a call from one of the daughters. She says, Dave, where in the Bible does it say that? I said, well, it says it in Psalm 90. So when I'm in this pastorate, then I go to grad school. And on my 6-hour Old Testament exam, I'm asked to do a big analysis, an hour of Psalm 90.
Oh.
And so I did it, and then I was able to use that example of how we need to interpret it properly. So I passed it. So that's an example. I just use that. Yes, the poetry's there, but we just have to be careful. And when we interpret, we have to interpret response. We're all, and we've known that in this class. We're kind of on the same page, but we're not. I mean, we're different people. We're going to read it differently. And so what I say to you, especially when we do have differences of opinion, let's just be responsible in our interpretation. And we can know that what it doesn't. We use our common sense, and we can learn what a responsive interpretation is and what one is. Okay, now what I want to do is we have some examples of a thought for thought translation, the New Living Translation, and then the Good News Translation in the Contemporary English Bible. So if you go to, let's see what you have on your translation. Yeah. Now, go to the next one. It says Matthew 1:18 in Greek. So we'll just review this because we're doing this with each translation category. So when I look at the Greek, it says now, the birth of Jesus Christ was in this way. All right, that's awkward. We're not going to say, okay, I had a grandson born in this way. We're going to say, I had a grandson who was born, right? But that's what it says, if you're going word for word. And then we'll see, we'll see how we saw how the New Revised Standard Version smoothed that out. We'll see how the New Living Translation smooths that out. Then it goes on to say, his mother Mary was engaged to Joseph before they came together. Now that's going to allow for different variations of translation. Came together, what does that mean? The New Revised Standard Version said before they lived together. Now, some people aren't, liking that, so we'll see what the New Living Translation does with that. But before, the Greek says before they came together. And here's the tough one. This is a Greek, I'm going to translate a Greek idiom to you. It's almost impossible to translate it into English. It's a Greek idiom. They know what it meant. And it crops up several times in the New Testament. But literally, it says, Mary, she was found to have in the womb, or she was found to have in the womb. Okay, what does that mean in English? You get the word womb and you can figure it out. But again, and I've talked about this, when you consult the Greek dictionaries and lexicons, this is an idiom that means a woman was pregnant. She was found to have in the womb. It means she was pregnant. Simple. So again, it's an idiom, and we have our English idioms. I mean, when we have some refugees, or maybe you talk about people who are dealing with English as a second language, and one of the first things that they struggle with is our idioms, because our idioms have something behind it. And so I remember when I was in grad school, I shared a room with someone from Vietnam and two Koreans, and they were always asking me, Dave, what's this idiom mean? What's this idiom mean? And then it helps you understand the culture, helps you understand the language, because a lot of times idioms are contemporary, they're time sensitive, not always.
And that goes from generation to generation, idioms change.
Yeah.
Last night we were with someone and I said, ne'er-do-well, I was talking about some ne'er-do-well. I don't know how many of you in this room know what ne'er-do-well means. And so
What you're gonna have to tell us.
it means lazy,
Uh-huh.
good for nothing.
Now, help me understand, what is the actual words you're using, ne'er-do-well?
Ne'er, N-E', do well.
That's a
Oh, never
contraction
do
for
well.
never,
Mhm.
never do well, yeah, now I get it, yeah. No, I don't think I heard, well, I probably heard it.
Yeah, it's an old fashioned, and in Google, when you Google it, it says it's an old term, an old
Yeah.
fashioned.
Luckily, when they told you that day, you didn't know what it means.
Let me take a personal.
Even when they were telling us, when they told us that.
I say that because Rick's right, my grandmother probably said that, and then as a kid, I wouldn't know, and maybe I did know, and then I forgot.
Why are you laughing?
That's a kind of way to say, you're so lazy, you're a bum.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, and that was my point, Anna, these things are, a lot of our idioms are time sensitive, or they're made for the period. There are some that kind of, well, they do get outdated, don't count your chickens before they hatch.
First base.
Yeah, getting to first base, all right. If you don't know anything about baseball, which just started, what, a week or two ago, hey, great, we're in the baseball season now. But,
That's nothing to do with baseball, you know that, right?
no, I didn't know that.
Oh. Wow.
You
Okay, you guys proud about it.
yeah, it started with baseball.
It did.
And then it went to, so it has several things. It means get to first base, as in maybe your job or whatever, and then we know where your mind is.
We are just a little red.
That's just the first base.
So, and that's a good example. Think about someone who's coming from another country and just take that one. Okay, you baseball, and then it means, getting on track or whatever, and then it has a romantic or sexual content. I'm not as stupid as I look. All right.
When did they lose control?
Okay, she was found to have in her womb from the Holy Spirit, so she was pregnant by the Holy Spirit. That's what the Greek says. Was someone calling my attention?
Yeah, well, it's like today, I was gonna continue a little bit. Today's, the kids, they have their own
Oh, gosh.
language.
That we're not going to understand,
No.
right? So,
They're young parents.
so it works both ways.
Yeah.
Yes, hey.
But even when I was in college, terms like slang terms where I went to school in Pennsylvania, when I went up to visit my cousin up in Boston, they had a different interpretation.
Oh, yeah.
And even when Seth was in middle school, he came home and he goes, he said about the girl across the street, he said, she's a slut. And I went, what? Because I knew her and I go, define that word. He said, well, that just means she likes different boys. They said, it was interesting because I repeated it at work and it was just the universal, all of us went, oh. Yeah, they had a whole different meaning to what that word
Okay,
was for
we
me.
can spend an hour on this and we're not going to. But, now this is geographical. Thanksgiving, what is filling? Stuffing, another word, dressing. And I think those are the three I know. And they are geographical. So it depends. Some of the idioms, this is just, how to use a word. They're time sensitive, but they're also geographical. One idiom in one culture or in one part of, let's say, the US, or let's say the world. And one part of the world might mean one thing and then another part of the world might have a different connotation. Joe?
One quirky example of this shift in language, Daniel Webster in the 1800s had his translation where he cleaned up some of the less savory phrases in the
Right.
King James Bible that were deemed just not quite for polite public use. And so it's interesting back to the Webster the Webster Bible translation and look what he found offensive.
Well, there's a passage in, well, it's in several. And I don't quite have it in my mind, but the Hebrew says he pisses against
That's
the
one
wall.
of them.
And that's one of them, basically,
And that was an idiom to say to men.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was basically an idiom, he just wasn't happy or whatever and was being defiant, so to piss against the wall, and that is, and the King James translated, it doesn't say pisses, it says pisseth. Is it? Yeah. So, that's, so there are idioms there. And so we can spend a lot of time with idioms, and we have our idioms, and we have idioms. And we just found one in the Greek about, she was found to have in her womb. Now, we just have another 10 minutes or so, and I think we can get through this. Let's look at the New Living Translation. I typed it out for you. This is what they say. Now, we'll start with the Greek. The birth of Jesus Christ was in this way. The first sentence. Now, how does the NLT do it? This is how Jesus, the Messiah, was born. Not bad. Now, the first thing you're going to notice is, well, wait a minute. The Greek says Jesus Christ, but the NLT, and if you remember, the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition, also used Messiah. This is how Jesus the Messiah was born. Now, this is going to be a little complicated, but the Greek word here is Christos, Christ, Christos. But Christos is a Greek translation of the Hebrew word Mashiach, which means the anointed one or the Messiah. So when you come to the Greek word Christos, it can mean Christ, or another Bible translation is the Messiah. So when you read the Greek in the New Testament, and when you see Christos, sometimes it's translated as Christ, sometimes it's translated as Messiah. And when we look at the translations we're working with in this 4-page handout, some of the translations I chose use the Messiah to translate Christos, and some use Christ to translate Christos. But that aside, the birth of Jesus Christ was in this way. This is how Jesus the Messiah was born. That's not bad, and that's a thought for thought translation. His mother was engaged to be married to Joseph. Now, the Greek says his mother was engaged to Joseph. What's the difference?
His mother.
Well, they both have his mother. The Greek says his mother Mary, they both say that his mother Mary was engaged to Joseph. The NLT says his mother Mary was engaged to be married to Joseph. Oh, no, Mary is. Yeah. So, to be married is not in the Greek. It's not there. So the NLT translators, they don't want you to, well, I think they're just being repetitive, because when you're engaged for what?
Yeah.
To be married. Joe, you're,
Yeah, sometimes when you contract, you engage. So you could say this was a business arrangement of some kind. I don't think that's a lot of what people think about, but that is a term used in legalese.
well, and Doug, he's with us today, and he mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, and I think it bears mentioning it again, is that because, and you look at verse 9, or the next verse, 19, when it's clear that Joseph has found out that Mary was pregnant, and he knows he's not the father because he's not. He was going to divorce her quietly. Well, how can he divorce her if they're just engaged? So what we know from those times is that engagement today is basically someone getting on their knee, usually the male, and giving a diamond ring or whatever. And that's pretty much it. There aren't a lot of contractual things going on, but in these times, it involved dowries, it involved family interaction. So to be engaged was contractual, much more contractual than being engaged in today's society. So when that engagement was broken off, then there had to be an official way, a legal way to break it off. Yes, Ann.
do we know when the marriage took place?
No,
But on the way to, where they have to go for the census?
yeah, they're from Nazareth
Yeah.
to
To Bethlehem,
Bethlehem, yes. That's correct.
because, does that give us a clue that says they are married?
Well, I think what,
It says espoused wife.
Yeah, oh,
okay,
Yeah, that phrase is definitely in there.
okay. Well, yeah, and we don't have anything in the text to tell us when the marriage took place. Did it take place before, after they went to Jerusalem? Did it take place between this discussion? Because in Matthew 1:18, an angel was coming to Joseph and telling him, he knows that Joseph is going to divorce her secretly or quietly. He says, no, don't do that. This is beyond your understanding. Don't worry about it. This is from the Holy Spirit. Go ahead and marry. So some scholars argue that because, as Doug pointed out online here a couple of weeks ago, there was, once you got engaged in those times, then the woman would continue to stay with her family for a period of time, usually a year, and then eventually move in with the husband, which usually meant moving in with his family. Not always, but most of the time. So some scholars are thinking that this was somewhere in between that. And remember, when we're dealing with biblical narrative, a lot of details are left out. The important thing here is that Mary, the birth of Jesus was conceived via the Holy Spirit, by way of the Holy Spirit. That's the main point. So when they actually get married, that's left out. And remember, we don't know hardly anything about Jesus' childhood except for that story in Luke about him being in the temple. So, and we also know that in Matthew that they had to go down to Egypt for a couple of years and then they came back. But other than that, we don't, so the details are left out when they got married. We assume there was a celebration for the engagement. We assume there was a celebration for the marriage but again, they didn't distinguish as much as we do between the marriage and the engagement. The marriage might have been the total end, the engagement beginning, but there was it was much more connected than it is in today's society. I'll just answer it that way. So, okay, what do you think? His mother Mary was engaged to be married to Joseph. So is that necessary? The NLT translators, they just don't want you to be in any confusion. So they're being repetitive here. And so this is a thought for thought. It might be going into a paraphrase because that's not in the Greek, but I'm just going to leave that as a thought for thought. His mother Mary was engaged to be married to Joseph. And you're not going to see that to be married. That's not going to be in a word for word translation because it's not in the Greek. Then, but before the marriage took place, remember the Greek says before they came together. Right? And so they don't, and the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition says before they lived together. And so some translations aren't going to like that. Mary and Joseph living together before the baby's born? No. So you have the New Living Translation, which is probably, even though it's a thought for thought translation, it's probably going to have a more conservative bent to it than the New Revised Standard Version. So you're going to see some things here. But before the marriage took place, and then we get, while she was still a virgin. That is not in the Greek. So this is where we're starting to get into a little bit of a paraphrase. here. There's a little bit of interpretation. Now, if you read Matthew and keep going to Matthew 21 to 23, it's very clear. Matthew is translating Isaiah. A young woman or a virgin conceived and so forth. I don't have to read that thing, but let's go there. I know we're getting out of time. Yeah, we can do this. Go to Matthew 1, 21 to 23. So what I'm saying is, just because the New Living Translation says in Matthew 1:18 that Mary's a virgin, in the Greek doesn't mean that the New Testament doesn't have the foundational notion that Mary was a virgin while she conceived when she had Jesus in the womb. So 21, she will bear a son and you are to name him Jesus. This is the angel talking to Joseph. He's really talking Joseph down here and saying, go ahead. I want you to marry Mary. She's going to bear this son. You're going to name him Jesus because he's going to save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. And they're quoting Isaiah 7:14. Look, the virgin shall become pregnant and give birth to a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel. Now, I might have a different connotation than Isaiah. That would require another session. But this is Matthew's way of saying that he had a virgin birth here, that Mary Mary conceived through the Holy Spirit. But it's very clear in Luke 1:27, the angel is talking.
Hey, help me out here.
Yeah.
I've been told, and that the reason there was such emphasis in the idea that she was virgin was to emphasize the fact that this was, that he was the Son of God and not of any mortal man. That's why the emphasis on that it was a virgin conception immaculate. Yeah, I should say virgin. She was virgin. Was just to emphasize the fact that this was divinely done. That there was in no way Jesus was half human, half God.
Yeah.
Just it was the point of that.
Well, I think so. I think that's probably a later theological interpretation, but I think the interpretation's sound because Matthew seems to be clear about it in verse 23. And then when you get to Luke 1:27, the angel is saying, hey, Mary, there was a woman, she was engaged to Joseph. No, there was a virgin who was engaged to Joseph. And by the way, her name is Mary. So you have this in Luke. And I think now it's in John where we really have that Jesus and God are one. So it's not that we don't have any notion, we can't say for sure, probably not, that Matthew and Luke knew about John. We think John was written later. So, but then you have this theological interpretation come up that you were talking about, but I think it's clear here, they're stressing that
The whole veneration of the Virgin rather than just, oh, it's more than just a young woman. She was virgin.
yeah.
This veneration of that state of a woman's.
I think what Matthew and Luke are stressing is the miraculous nature of it, as opposed to that. It's not till you get to John that Jesus and God are of the same substance, they're.
I would love to know when the term virgin came into the use of the translations.
Well,
Rather
didn't
than-
the ancient Greeks also have Apollo was a virgin birth god? Like, it's not the first time
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
a deity is considered special because they were born of a virgin.
Okay, well, I'll answer your question, and this may run us out of time, but, the Greek we have a Greek translation of Matthew 1:23. And translating from Isaiah. And Isaiah says it was a young woman, not a virgin. And there is a Hebrew word, virgin. Isaiah chooses not to use it. Now, if she was a young woman, most likely she was a virgin. But when the Greek translators came to the Old Testament, they chose to be virgin. So when Matthew is quoting Isaiah, he's not working with the Hebrew. He's working with the Greek. So when he translates Isaiah, he translates it as virgin, where the Hebrew in Isaiah says young woman or young girl. And that's very clear because there is a specific word for virgin in Hebrew, and Isaiah doesn't choose it. But that's not to say he didn't think that she was a virgin. He's not here, we can't ask him, but that's and commentators get into all that. Okay, we're out of time, and I know some need to leave. We almost got through it. And come back and review this.